Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, Senator Kevin Cramer takes your questions. Remember, he's on every week, so if you want to submit questions, you can do so to rob@sayanythingblog.com. Really, anytime you think about it, you don't have to wait until, it's the day before he's going to be on or the day of. You can, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday and you come up with a question for the senator for some reason, send it over to me. I'll save it and I'll ask him. We've been getting a lot of questions for the senator. In fact, it ended up being a pretty long interview today, just so that we could get to all the questions and let him answer them in full. But you know what? That's okay. He's making his time available. I'm making this podcast available to provide a venue for this sort of thing. So if you're into it, participate by all means. But before we get there, I want to talk maybe a little bit more about a topic we had on the show earlier this week. I had on Jennifer Galbraith. She is an epidemiologist with the North Dakota Department of Health, and we were talking about vaccinations. Now, nationally, measles are becoming a problem again. In fact, there was one city in our country that went so far as to ban unvaccinated people from public places, things like playgrounds and schools and, well, even grocery stores. Now, I'm honestly not sure how I feel about that. I feel like there may be some constitutional issues at play there, but what's interesting is my interview with Jennifer Galbraith, and also I had a print column in the newspapers about this as well. My argument is essentially that vaccinations are good. They're not perfect. Not saying that. There's certainly it's been throughout the history of vaccinations, there's been constant improvement, and also everybody's medical history, everybody's situation is unique. For some people, vaccinations aren't right. Their doctor is going to advise them that they shouldn't get vaccinated because of medical reasons, and well, that's okay too. My problem, though, is there's a very anti-science, and I realize that's a loaded term with everything about the climate change. I think there's a lot of people out there who, hang a lab coat on their political opinions and call it science, and then accuse anybody who disagrees with their political opinions of being anti-science. So I want to be careful not to fall into that trap. But to me, the efficacy of vaccinations on the whole, again, acknowledging that they've not been perfect and there's been a long history of work and by medical professionals to improve vaccinations, but on the whole, they have reduced suffering in society. On the whole, vaccinations have ensured that fewer people get sick, fewer people suffer, fewer people die. And it's frustrating to me on a very personal level to see people fight this. It's frustrating to me to hear people talk about vaccinations as though they're poison, and they're saying, "Well, I'm not going to poison my kid. I'm not going to put, I'm not going to put, chemicals in my kid's blood." And it frustrates me. Now, I realize some of this comes from a very personal place. I had a relative at one point in my life who got very sick. This is not a vaccination story, but she got very sick. But it was a treatable disease. A disease where, treating it doesn't guarantee outcome, but, it certainly could have prolonged her life, if nothing else, and maybe she could have even survived, but she didn't because her parents belonged to a religion that frowns on, and in fact frowns on things like blood transfusions and bone marrow transfusions and things like that. Maybe I'm giving some of this away by saying that. I'm trying not to give away too many details because it is private, but I will tell you that I and others in my family had to watch as this member of our family was allowed to die with her parents looking on because of religious belief. That was hard to swallow. And I will tell you that to this day, when I think about it, it fills me with rage. I don't understand why, when human endeavor has made scientific advancements, medical advancements, technological advancements that can allow us to live happier lives, more healthy lives, longer lives, why would we not avail ourselves of this? I am deeply respectful of sincerely held religious beliefs. I think that everybody ought to be able to live their lives the way they want to live. But the vaccination issue, the medical care issue, has a wrinkle to that. If you were just making decisions for yourself, well then fine. C'est la vie. We're all going to go through this life, and we all should be able to go through this life in a manner that we see fit. The problem, though, is when you start making decisions for other people. When you make a decision not to vaccinate your child, from my point of view, you're putting your child at risk. And when you make a decision not to vaccinate yourself or your child, you're putting other people at risk. Right? So there's the herd immunity issue, right? Where if we drop below a certain level of vaccination, that creates space where diseases like the measles, I mean, we're literally seeing this right now, where diseases like the measles can come back and cause more suffering and even death. That's a very real problem. Also, there are people in our society who can't. We just refer to them. There are people in our society who cannot vaccinate for medical reasons. They cannot get the shot. Well, even if they wanted to, it would do them more harm than good because of some unique set of medical circumstances that's unique to them. They cannot get vaccinated. It's incumbent upon the rest of us to vaccinate in order to protect those people. Also, by the way, the elderly, sometimes even if they were vaccinated earlier in life, later in life, they become weaker. Their immune systems become, and I'm not a doctor here, but this is just logical. This just makes sense. These older people or maybe people who have become sick or whatever, they're susceptible to these diseases as well. So it's important that we vaccinate in order to protect them. I mean, to me, it's a societal responsibility. Now, in the past, I think we've been very lucky where the number of people who have opted to not vaccinate has been relatively low. In fact, so low that it didn't really matter if we put in the law some allowances to let people opt out just for personal reliefs or religious beliefs, right? North Dakota has 3 exemptions, right? And as you heard with my interview with Jennifer Galbraith earlier this week, there's 3 exemptions. There's the medical exemption, which we've discussed. There's a religious exemption. And then there's the largest source of exemptions, which is just a personal belief exemption where you can exempt your kids from getting or yourself from getting vaccinated for pretty much any reason at all. You just have to say, well, it's, because of some sincerely held personal beliefs that I have, I'm not going to get vaccinated. And you're allowed to do that. And as long as it was small numbers, it was fine. But now that those numbers are growing, and they are growing in North Dakota, right? We go back a decade, and it was like around 1% of kindergartners were being exempted for personal belief reasons. That number is up over 3%. It's almost 4% if we count the religious exemption people. It's growing. And what troubles me is it's growing because of ignorant things that people believe. And this is what's kind of amazing to me. In response to my print column and in response to the interview I did with Jennifer Galbraith earlier this week, people have come out of the woodwork to attack me. And granted, I've given it to them back a little bit, and so maybe I've called some of it down on myself, but I come out of the work to just go on the attack. And anybody who would suggest that vaccinations work. It's sort of amazing to me. And what's really frustrating is the sources these people, they're using, discredited bureaucrats. I've had no fewer than half a dozen chiropractors who work in the state of North Dakota, chiropractors, who, although they call themselves doctors, are not qualified to talk about things like injections, are not qualified to talk about, epidemiology or viruses or anything like that. They're no more qualified to talk about it than I am. Now, listen, I think we should all be able to debate this as a societal question, as a public policy question, but I'm not on here giving people medical advice. I support vaccinations because people I trust and smart people, and a lot of them, say it works. And also, we have data collected by academics, data collected by government agencies, federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies. We have all sorts of this data, nonprofits. We have all of this data, which shows the same thing. There is a strong correlation between society getting vaccinated and a decline in communicable diseases. I'm not the one saying that. Experts are saying that. Meanwhile, people who have no business weighing in on these matters, it is far outside their areas of expertise, are now suddenly saying, I'm a doctor, therefore this, that, and the other thing about vaccinations. People telling me to watch this movie, Vaxxed, which was, by the way, produced by the discredited researcher who was the source for the original myth that there's a link between vaccinations and autism. That man is a fraud. That man is a huckster. That man has been discredited. His research has been withdrawn from the peer-reviewed publications in which it was published. And yet still, his malfeasance lives on. It's really sort of amazing. And by the way, this doesn't cross. I got an email from a listener, Sandra. She emailed and she says, or I should say she's a reader. She read the print column. Sandra emailed. She says, Mr. Port, I found your opinion piece on anti-vaccinations quite interesting. This is the only time I would ever contact you, as I find your anti-liberal diatribe disgusting. I feel that I must correct you as to your assessment of the liberal population not vaccinating. I have two brothers-in-law, doctors of chiropractic, that spread the myth about vaccines and autism. They are 100% Republican, as are the majority of the family. One of these families have not vaccinated their children, and a few years ago, their children got whooping cough. All three of them were very ill and could have spread this horrible disease to innocent bystanders. Again, this is not a liberal issue. Well, I would note that in my column, I didn't say it was a liberal issue. In fact, I pointed out that anti-vaccination sentiment crosses party lines. It's actually kind of amazing. I mean, there are uber-rich Hollywood celebrities, right? Models and actors and everything who think that vaccines cause autism. They're opposed to vaccines. There are poor people, dirt poor people, who believe the same thing. There are granola-eating atheist hippies, right, or New Age Wiccans who are anti-vaccination, and there are Bible-thumping fundamentalist Christians who are anti-vaccinations. This nonsense transcends traditional political and social lines like few other issues. And in a lot of ways, I think it's an illness in our society. And there's a lot of this sort of ignorance, I think, especially in the age of the internet. There's a lot of this sort of ignorance that has cropped up. I mean, you look at the rise of the Flat Earth Society. I just watched a documentary about that on Netflix. I'm forgetting the name of it now. I'm sure you can find it. It's excellent. I mean, it's an interesting look. And the thing is these are not dumb people who believe this. I mean, these are relatively successful, relatively intelligent people who, for whatever reason, have decided that the earth is flat. And they now accept it as an article of faith, and they're not going to back down. Any evidence to the contrary, they're just going to loop into their conspiracy. They're just going to, weave it into the fabric of what they want to believe. And on it goes. There's no convincing these people. And it's scary. And so I think that brings us to the question, what do we do about this? And I'll tell you, I have a hard time supporting mandatory vaccinations. I just do. And the reason why I have a hard time supporting mandatory vaccinations is that it's not something, I don't want the government to just be able to stick a needle in your arm without you being able to have a say in it. And also, I think it's counterproductive to try to force people to do the right thing. I think generally in society, we're better off if we inspire people to choose to do the right thing. If you force people, it's just going to breed, resentment. And really, you end up making martyrs out of people, right? Because if you force people, then now they're martyrs, and now they have even more, reason to complain. Oh, look what the government's forcing me to do against my will, right? I don't want to turn anybody into a martyr. And so I think everybody should be able to make their choices about vaccinations. And as much as it hurts my soul to say this, I think even you got to let parents make that decision for their kids. I think that sucks. I wish the kids had a say in it, but I can't think of it unless we're going to have the state start raising everybody's kids, and that's not a road I want to go down. I think you got to let them make those decisions. But on the flip side, I think maybe there should be some consequences for those decisions. And when I say consequences, I think, already to get admitted to schools, you have to be vaccinated. Now, we have some exemptions to that. I think maybe those exemptions should end. I think we should get rid of the religious exemption. I think that we should get rid of the personal choice exemption. At the very least, we should get rid of the personal choice exemption. If you want to go to public schools, if you want to enjoy that benefit that the taxpayers provide, then you need to be vaccinated. I think that if you want to get admitted to a public college, a public university, you need to be vaccinated. If you want to qualify for federal aid, for federal student loans, I think you need to be vaccinated or have a valid medical exemption. I am all for medical exemptions. I think that those are just fine. But outside of those, I think there's a lot of things that we could do for the government, a lot of programs, a lot of benefits that we could say, listen, if you want these things, well, we need proof that you're vaccinated. You're allowed to make your choices, but the rest of us don't necessarily have to, just pretend like you're not making a choice that puts the rest of us in danger. The rest of us are allowed to respond to that. You can make your choices, and we can make ours. And I think there's a lot of choices we can make to if you choose not to be vaccinated, if you choose to make our society more dangerous by not vaccinating, we could choose for that to have consequences for you. I think that's the right path forward. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me now, as he does every week, to take your questions. Remember, if you want to submit your questions, you can at any time to rob@sayanythingblog.com. Also, I put up social media threads on Facebook and Twitter under my account, Rob Port, under Say Anything Blog. So if you follow those accounts, you'll see those threads every week. You can feel free to throw your question in there. But I know not everybody maybe not wants their name publicly attached to their questions, so if you want to email them to me as well, you can certainly do that. Once again, that's rob@sayanythingblog.com. Kevin, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks, Rob. It's a kind of a wild and woolly week in Washington this week with the big rules change that we're in the middle of today, and this, of course, being Wednesday. So that's been a little bit exciting, to say the least.
So why Wednesday? You guys vote on rule changes on Wednesday? Why is it?
Not generally. I just wanted to make sure, realizing that we're not on live, that as people might listen to this, that they know that we are doing this vote on Wednesday.
Yeah, we actually record these. Every podcast I usually record the day before, except for Mondays. Usually I hit that on Friday. But yeah, so we're recording this on Wednesday. People will be listening to this on Thursday. You sent out a press release earlier this week on I guess it's the Senate nominations reform. I think that's what we're calling this. Your statement statement yesterday was, I quote, "Over the last 2 years, the Senate has filed cloture on 148 nominees and conducted cloture votes on 128 of them. At this pace, if cloture is required on each nomination, it could take more than 5 years to confirm all of President Trump's remaining nominees. The system has to change. I voted for these common sense reforms to modernize the nominations process and ensure arcane procedural tactics cannot be weaponized to enforce such unprecedented obstruction against the current president and any future president." This makes I have some reserves. I like the filibuster for policy. I think maybe you and I disagree on that. But for nominations, sure. I think at some point, you just got to let the president govern, right? It's his administration. Right. He should appoint who he wants. If he appoints somebody truly awful to a position, whether it's President Trump or some future president, if they appoint somebody who's just completely inappropriate or completely unqualified, you would hope that there would be a large enough bipartisan majority to block that, thus fulfilling Congress's advise and consent role. But outside of that, it's the president. Just because you might differ with one of his picks philosophically, well, he won the election. At some point, you just got to let him govern.
Well, and what's interesting about this is, first of all, the filibuster. I think you make an important distinction, by the way, between what's called the legislative calendar, that's policy, laws, and what's called the executive calendar, that's the confirmation process of judges and justices and cabinet members, and then a whole bunch, several hundred sub-cabinet members. And so those are different. But the filibuster, the cloture, that's the vote that, to end debate, and then you have another 30 hours of debate. That's never been used up until 2003. That was never used for confirmations or nominations. Even Clarence Thomas, who was the most controversial, justice ever confirmed to the Supreme Court prior to Brett Kavanaugh, In fact, he passed on a 52 to 48 floor vote and did not come out.
Do you think he was more controversial than Bork? Was he more controversial? Because Bork didn't even make it, though.
Well, but he didn't make it, right. And there were others, like Miguel Estrada, that didn't make it. There were others that didn't get through, to your previous point, actually, and probably some of them really good people like Bork. But now with Clarence Thomas, as harshly as Democrats opposed him, nobody asked for cloture. Nobody required 60 votes. And so that's a brand new tradition that was started ironically, maybe not so ironically, by Chuck Schumer when he was a new junior senator from New York, and George Bush had become president, and he's the one that did a little seminar, brought a couple of liberal law professors in, and taught them how to use all the tools in the tool chest to stop the clock, if you will, and prevent George Bush's people from getting confirmed. But just to put it in further context, those 128 cloture votes that happened in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, the previous three presidents in their first 2 years had a grand total of 24 cloture votes. So I think 4 for 1, 8 for 1, and 12 for 1. And so it really is a phenomenon that has, that started in 2003 and really escalated, obviously, with this president, and including, Rob, by the way, 30 hours of debate on the general counsel to the USDA, people who pass with unanimous votes after the 30 hours. So, they're just using the procedural trick to stop the clock and not let President Trump fill his sub-cabinet and his executive positions. So, abuse is when rules get changed. That's, that's what results when you abuse the rules, is you get new rules. And so, but we're not talking about some 200-year-old tradition here. We're talking about a 2-decade tradition, not even.
Well, and I mean, listen, if we're in a situation where it takes longer than the president's term in office that he's elected to confirm all of his appointments, something's wrong. I mean, something's broken with that. Right. And again, it's not about, well, I don't like Trump, so I don't want any of his nominees. That can't be the standard. Trump won the election. Right. President Obama won the election. I didn't like a lot of his nominees. I didn't like a lot of their philosophical leanings or what have you, their policy preferences. But Obama won. And he gets to a point. And, at some point, you just got to live with that. So what are you voting? You said you're in the midst of votes today. What are you voting on to change today?
Yeah, that's a great question, because first thing we did is yesterday we invoked cloture to vote on a rules change in hopes that we could get some Democrats to go along with the rule change. And by the way, all we were doing is really changing the rule back to the way we agreed with Democrats to do when Barack Obama was president. That's the other rich irony here is there was a 2-year stint that Republicans joined Democrats to change the rules back to similar to what they are now. But the problem is it was sunset in 2 years. So the way this works is they didn't, no Democrat voted for the rule change. So therefore, we then took it upon ourselves as the majority to change the rules. And the way it happens, it sounds very nerdy, but the way it happens is first there was a confirmation nominee that was presented today for cloture, and that passed. And then the Leader McConnell, made a motion to change from 30 hours to 2 hours for this sub-cabinet nominee. And that then requires a rule of the chair and an appeal to the chair. So we're voting on these things, and just finished that what I just concluded, an appeal on the ruling of the chair. So now that we're in the middle of the 2-hour debate on this sub-cabinet member. When that's done, then the leader's going to present a district court nominee. We'll do the same exercise and then vote to change the rule and appeal the chair's ruling. And then that'll go for 2 hours. And what that does, Rob, is that sets precedent going forward. And just so people know, and I think this is an important point, as Republicans who are in a 53-47 majority in the Senate with a Republican president, we are voting to make this permanent so that we are prepared to live with the very same rule when the tables are turned. For all the reasons you've just said, elections have consequences. This is not the legislative calendar. This is not the filibuster. This is simply the executive calendar and allowing the president. And I might even add, Rob, there is the other check and balance. It's not just 30 hours of debate. And by the way, we're not talking about 30 hours. It's just a 30-hour clock where sometimes it takes as little as 1 or 2 minutes of debate, but they still run out the 30-hour clock. You still have the committee process where there's the background checks and the hearing process and the interview process. So it's not like we're just throwing people into these positions either. There's plenty of process to cover it all.
Let me last question on this, then we're going to move on.
Sure.
Could part of the reform be maybe we don't need to have the Congress confirm some of these people? I say that I look at sometimes at North Dakota and some of our statewide elected offices, like insurance commissioner. All due respect to John Gottfried, I think he's a great guy. I'm not real sure why we're electing that office. They're not making policy, so I think sometimes we get carried away. And is it that sort of a thing? Are we confirming too many people? At some point, can we just say, Mr. President, hire who you want? Maybe we don't need. I mean, and I'm not talking about like judges and stuff like that. Okay, I get it. But some of this stuff, and I had a great example, and now I'm forgetting it. But if somebody do a trade office or something, come on, can the president just hire somebody? We can just get over it.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So there are a lot of, several hundred, maybe thousands of. In fact, I'm sure there are more than 1,000, maybe 2,000 that require confirmation. And what they often are, a lot of them are in the military. A lot of them are, combatant commanders for the various theaters and functions in the military. But a lot of them are undersecretaries, assistant undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, deputy undersecretaries, general counsels, all kinds of positions that require the confirmation of the Senate. And I think you raise a very important and valid point. But the challenge then is, if they're not political, there needs to be some system for differentiating between political and career bureaucrats as well. I'd be all for loosening up the rules as it relates to, the ability to get rid of people that aren't performing, because there's a whole bunch of that in the federal government as well. And they're protected by, these civil service rules that aren't very well thought out, or at least they benefit the bureaucrat a lot more than they do the taxpayer. And so somehow it would require a lot of reform, but I think you make a good point. I don't think everything needs to be confirmed by the Senate. I don't feel let's face it, it's not like we're looking deep into every assistant deputy undersecretary of agriculture in their background to make an informed decision as a Senate anyway.
I had some other questions that I wanted to ask you, but our submitted questions actually pretty much covered everything. So we're going to get right into them, and we have quite a few of them this week. So going to start with Duke on Facebook. He says, please ask him why it is so hard for Republicans to observe the Trump model of standing up to the media and not cowering to the demands of the anti-Americans. I really want to know why the Republicans refuse to hold their ground and why they continue to let government get bigger and bigger. Do they believe in limited government or not?
Well, that sounds like two questions.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. There's the media thing, which there is no question that Donald Trump has. Donald Trump stands his ground, to quote the questioner. I mean, he's exactly right. And I think there are people that have observed it and thought, this works better than I might have thought it did, to stand up to them and to push back hard. Never admit a mistake, even in some cases, but to always play the strong position. He does always come from the strongest position and pushes back hard. And because some people might think it hasn't worked for him. I happen to think it's worked pretty well for him. As you know, I haven't been afraid to stand up to the media either. I do differentiate, however, between what I consider free market media, that is to say, people who aren't riding on, federally supported or federally funded airwaves, and then media that I think has a little more responsibility to fairness, mainly, of course, networks. I think you've commented some on even my position of political expression at banks. As long as banks want to be insured by the federal government, I think they have a different responsibility than a pawn shop downtown. But I do think that Donald Trump has, at least demonstrated a new standard that some may want to try to follow. I'm one who's never easily, I shouldn't say never, I'm one that's not easily offended by the media. I don't even mind for the hard-hitting questions. Sometimes they get the best of me, and sometimes I might get the best of them. But at the end, I think that the public is pretty well served by very free and open media, and then the public will decide which one they want to pay attention to, much like people who listen to this podcast or read your blog. with regard to limited government, so the Trump model, I don't know that, Donald Trump has presented some pretty conservative budgets, and of course he's advocated and passed some really strong tax cuts. I don't know that he's the real limited government guy, but he's the most limited government president we've had in a very, very long time. I think if I might just sort of take some liberty with what the person might be referring to, it might just be the ability to say no. And that is a difficult thing in politics when you have 50 states with 2 senators each and 435 members of Congress who largely view their reelection as a test of whether they're able to perform or produce for the people back home. And I think you've raised the issue pretty regularly with regard to, for example, in our case, farm programs. But even Donald Trump didn't want to tackle Social Security. And if you don't tackle Social Security, you're never going to, get to the limited government that we'd all like to see.
Next is Greg from Facebook. Why do welfare people and the Muslim people get more money and EBT for food, yet people who work for 50 hours get so little for all the work they did to build the country? Why can't retired people get EBT for food? And again, 2 questions. I'm not sure welfare people, Muslim people. I'm not sure what he means there, but I think everybody. There's no like racial or religious qualification. Right. Mostly it's like an economic means testing. Right. If you're below a certain level, you qualify for food testing. So I'm not real sure what he's there. But let's focus on EBT for retired people, for the elderly. Is that something that's on your radar?
Well, here's the way I would look at the safety net program, and I think that again, I'm with you. I don't know what a particular religion or ethnicity has to do with any of it, but I do think when we look at our safety net programs, if we want to talk, food support, food for the hungry, that's a good area. The one thing that I think that conservatives sometimes miss is creating perverse incentives for people to work. So on the one hand, if everything's free, you have an incentive to not work. On the other hand, if somebody goes to work and the first thing the government does is pulls away all of their services, then you also create an incentive for people to not work. In other words, I think we need to find a more measured approach, whether it's childcare, whether it's food stamps or SNAP, whether it's home heating assistance. What we ought to do is not punish people for getting a job. But at the same time, we have to find some way to wean people toward a living wage, if you will, a job that provides a living wage. But there are lots of people that have a lot to offer and could provide in terms of productivity to our society that we don't give a lot of incentive to get a job because it's more productive not to, and we punish them if they do. So. Well, I think, a longer philosophical answer, but
I think what happens is you get to a point where you're on the bubble, right? Like maybe you're to a point where you're going to get a job, but that job is going to boost you over the means testing for whatever program you're on, whether it's like heating assistance or food stamps or
right.
TANF or whatever it is. So there's like a gap there, and I think sometimes you're right. We've created that, and there becomes this sort of chasm that you have to like leap, or you sometimes have to negotiate if you want to get back into the workforce, back to a place where you're gonna maybe be self-sufficient. You got to try to jump over this chasm, because the minute you get a job and you start getting some income in, now all the support you've been leaning on falls away. So what we need is more like an on-ramp, right? It's like we gotta let people get in a slow lane for a little while, let them get up to speed with everybody else, and then maybe slowly start pulling some of it back and letting them stand on their 2 feet. But you can't just, push them and expect them to jump over this cliff. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, and when you look at our economy today, Rob, I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have in our economy today is a workforce. And yet we still have nearly a third of our eligible workforce not working. So, and I'm not talking about people on unemployment. I'm just talking about actual workforce participation. We continue to have a pretty low workforce participation rate, and a lot of it is the result of exactly what you and I are talking about. And that plus some other things like, a disconnected education system that pushes 4-year degrees in 5 years, 6 years, and MBAs when a CDL is a better certificate.
Yeah.
And we just some of that's cultural, but some of it's very intentional at the state level as well.
I think the other mistake conservatives make is as a lot of us start thinking that those people who are afraid to jump over that chasm, right? They've got some support programs and they're on them, but now they're afraid to take that next step because if they lose them, and we start they're lazy, they don't want to work, whatever. Insulting these people is not going to help. And a lot of them, it's not that they don't want to work. It's not like they like being where they're at. It's just, we've created a situation where there's risk there. And I think they get scared. And I think a lot of us would be scared if we were in that situation. So
I don't think there's any question. I'm with you. I agree. It's not, there's no one size fits all, obviously.
No, there isn't.
We can do a lot better.
We can. Next question. Robin asks, it seems like all Republicans, except a few, want to just spend. It's the same thing the Democrats want to do, just a different letter tied to a name. Can Senator Cramer commit to voting for, submitting, and writing fiscally responsible and conservative bills? Can Senator Cramer commit to upholding the Constitution, which may go against what the president wants?
So we always have to uphold the Constitution. We pledge that when we get sworn in. And then every bill that gets introduced has to pass a constitutional muster. And then, or every bill that gets introduced, it has to be signed off on as a statement of Constitution is part of the actual bill. The thing, though, about responsible spending, for example, as well. I'm on the budget committee. We just passed out a pretty lean budget by comparison last week. It didn't get much, if any, coverage whatsoever, but it does create a glide path toward a balance over the years. But again, if we don't deal with and even President Trump doesn't want to deal with Social Security, Medicare, a little bit on Medicare now in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse, and that's what our bill did. It goes after waste, fraud, and abuse, even in USDA programs. And I'm a strong proponent, obviously, of the Farm Bill. I was on the Farm Bill Conference Committee, but ours has a $9 billion savings by going after waste, fraud, and abuse in the safety net for the SNAP program specifically. And so, we need to continue that. I do exactly what they're talking about. But here's the better thing. How about extending the Constitution? I'm all for a constitutional amendment that requires a balanced budget. And if they want to make it in 10 years or 15 years so we can sort of glide into it, I'm all about that, because I think the only way, in fact, I appreciated the way that email started out. It was, with the exception of a very few, it seems like all Republicans, want to spend. Well, the one thing that would help that would be a constitutional amendment, because then you'd have no choice but to find ways to cut. Either that or, God forbid, the other outcome would be higher taxes, because the other way to balance a budget is to add revenue. And as we know, or at least I believe, raising taxes doesn't add revenue. It just hurts the economy.
Marv wants to secede from where he's currently living. Marv on Facebook says, I'm from Northwest Minnesota. Ask him what steps we need to take to get annexed by North Dakota.
Well, what we should have done, I've often joked when those guys push for the Red River diversion coming on our side of the border, we should put on the Minnesota side of the border, and then we could have taken western Minnesota into North Dakota. We have a lot more in common with them than they have with Minneapolis.
Reroute the red?
I do love
that what we're gonna,
reroute the red. That was my motto.
Yeah, there we go. Brock asks, again via Facebook, ask him about the Republican health care plan. How is it going to improve the system for middle-class North Dakotans? And just to expand on that, we've gotten a lot of, President Trump, said, well, we're gonna go pivot to healthcare. And that's not exactly what he said, but kind of what he implied. And then Majority Leader McConnell saying, oh no, let's pump the brakes on that a little bit till after the elections. Yeah. I got to tell you, after everything, I'll go repeal and replace, and then our replace plan failed, and Republicans have really lost me on health care. And this latest, this is not inspiring a lot of confidence, where the president says, hey, let's get something cooking on health care. Senate Leader McConnell says, oh no, hold on, not till after the election. Are we ever going to pass a replacement plan for this?
So it's a really good, important point. It was interesting. I was with the president when he said that, and he stopped and talked to the media and said, we're going to be the party of health care. And he came in and sprung it on the Republican senators at lunch last week. And it was either last week or the week before. But anyway, and a lot of people sort of gasped because they haven't seen that as a real winning issue. But his point is this, and I don't disagree with his point, and that is that right now the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, as we know, is considering this case to determine whether Obamacare is even constitutional. And the case stems from a ruling in Texas by a district judge that it is not constitutional. That because of the individual mandate going away, or the tax penalty for people that don't have individual health insurance, that this district court ruled that then it's unconstitutional. He did not stay the Obamacare, however, so it's still in place. The Fifth Circuit's now considering it, or at least a panel of the Fifth Circuit. If they uphold the judge's decision, I mean, that means that Obamacare is unconstitutional. And if it continues to go all the way up through the Supreme Court, and there's a lot of people who think if it does do that, whenever it happens, that it would in fact be deemed unconstitutional, then what do we have to replace it with, other than going right back to what we had before? So that's the dilemma. And, there's all the sky is falling rhetoric, of course, again, that means that 20 million people will be kicked off their health care plan. Well, all it means is that you don't have to get it if you don't want it anymore. That's a far cry from being kicked off of it. And it wouldn't have the, maybe some of the large subsidies. I would think the court in that case would have some sort of a glide path. But in the meantime, I do think it makes sense to have some things in order. North Dakota, of course, has Medicaid expansion. We did come within one vote. I say we passed it in the House, and the Senate failed by one vote. We all know that famous day, that famous night, when John McCain gave the thumbs down as the last vote and killed the replacement. That would have been very good for North Dakota. I would think that some sort of a Republican health care plan would look similar to that, to a Graham Cassidy, or something that is more block grant oriented, gives more authority to states. But we'd want to watch all of that very, very carefully. I think association health plans, frankly, are one of the very important, good first steps. President Trump has already issued an order that's now being, an executive order that's now being carried out by the Department of Labor. That's why I had Labor Secretary Acosta in North Dakota a couple of weeks ago to meet with insurance companies and in associations like Farmers Union and the Farm Bureau and Chamber of Commerce and others, to look at the possibility of helping individuals and small businesses associate together and to be able to provide the same type of health care that the vast majority of North Dakotans already get from their employer, from their large employer. That's really when healthcare is at its best, when you have a lot of people in the pool and a lot of variety, and most Americans, frankly, and many large majority of North Dakotans get their healthcare from their employer. And that's a far better program than the Medicare for None, as we like to call it, which would eliminate all private health care altogether that the Democrats are pushing, and just have a one-size-fits-all government-run system.
Larry on Twitter asks, we spend billions on NATO, but Germany makes a big purchase of Russian natural gas. Why spend U.S. tax dollars to defend Europe when they are in a large sense supporting the country we are trying to protect them from? Now, I know and I had the press release here, the NATO Secretary General just addressed a joint session of Congress, so kind of a timely question here. But to his point, I mean, it's kind of they're buying a lot of energy from Russia, and simultaneously Russia's kind of a threat to Europe, and in fact the threat that NATO was formed to oppose.
Well, he's exactly right. And so this is why President Trump took on Angela Merkel a couple of years ago. It seems like it was probably a couple of years ago now, at one of the conferences. It wasn't a NATO conference, but some European conference, over this Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. And we're looking at sanctioning that pipeline now. And the reason is that it's a pipeline that brings Russian gas to Germany, to Europe through Germany. Germany would be facilitating a pipeline system throughout its country to get, gas to other places, and paying some hideous amount of money for it too. And so while they're making themselves dependent on Russian energy, and then at the same time they're not paying their fair share of NATO costs. Now, I will say this, and the Secretary General talked about it today, and he complimented Donald Trump and expressed appreciation for his strong support for the other countries other than the United States to lift a little more, to pay more of their own national defense. And they've gone up, considerably already, and they're going a lot further. Everybody, that is, except Germany. And so I think that the tweet is right on point, which is, again, this is why Germany is being treated a little bit differently than the rest of Europe. But the rest of Europe has stepped it up considerably thanks to Donald Trump's strong urging. But he's exactly right. There's an irony, a hypocrisy, really, in Germany's posture with regard to NATO and Russian energy.
Another question from Twitter. Ask him why many Republicans seem unwilling to review Mueller's full report, given that it presumably exonerates the president, and if that only increases public suspicions that, in fact, it doesn't.
Well, first of all, most Republicans I know do support it. In fact, so does Bill Barr, the Attorney General. But I might just say this is not so much a Republican issue. I mean, the Department of Justice responds to prosecution and to prosecutorial findings by indicting people or not indicting them. And in this case, there is no indictment to be had. So they basically are responding the way they always respond, except in this case, because there's so much more interest in Donald Trump than there is in anybody else in the world. And because the Democrats made this such a hallmark and promised beyond a shadow of the doubt that crimes had been committed, that collusion was certain. They're feeling that the sting of the rebuke of the Mueller investigation that finds no collusion. Now, the report's going to be released by mid-April. Now, some people are going to scream and holler. Some names are redacted, or some testimony is redacted. But people have to also understand that in an investigation, particularly one that involves witnesses from other countries, these are informants for the Department of Justice, that they have to be protected. And if they're not protected, you're never going to get good witnesses. You're not going to get people to testify. So I have no doubt that if they were to hang Donald Trump with the cross, Democrats would complain that the nails weren't rusty enough. I mean, there's no pleasing them. But most Republicans I know want full disclosure of the report, even though it's not required at all. But a lot of Democrats are disappointed in the outcome.
Last questioner, but he's got two questions. His first question, I'll ask him separately. His first question is, are you for or against closing down the border, and why?
I don't support closing down the border. I think it'd be economic chaos. And really, it's a little bit like taking guns away from law-abiding citizens. All you do is just sort of force you stop legal commerce and legal immigration, legal crossing, and illegal crossings will just continue. The one thing it would do is put some pressure on Mexico, and I think there's plenty of ways to put pressure on Mexico without just shutting down the border. And we could do it with less aid or some other means. But I think a complete border shutdown would be too chaotic.
Second question is, which is more important to you, reducing child rape or cheap avocados? And I guess I'm not sure the context of that question. I suspect it has something to do with the border and trade. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I don't really understand the question either. I suppose the question presumes that if you shut down the border, you're no longer going to have children trafficked. My point is, shutting down the border will have nothing to do with having children trafficked, because all you'll do is stop cheap avocados from coming across, but you've done nothing to stop.
Well, people who are doing things across the border illegally are already doing something illegal. I mean, this sounds like putting up a gun-free zone sign, hoping to stop guns. Right. The only people who follow gun-free zone laws are people who follow laws and don't murder other people or don't use guns for illegal purposes. So. Exactly. I don't know. That seems a strange question. Yep. Senator, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Pleasure's all mine. Thanks.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. If you would, a favor, if you're listening to this podcast on a platform that allows you to rate or review, something like iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, if you would leave an honest rating and review, I would sure appreciate it. It helps get the show out there. It helps the show reach new listeners. So that's a very, very good thing if you would do that for me. If you have any feedback on the show, email it to rob@sayanythingblog.com, including questions for our weekly guest, Senator Kevin Cramer or Congressman Kelly Armstrong. Or if you just want to say hi, you can email me and say hi. You could also say hi to me on Facebook or Twitter. If you just search for me, Rob Port, I'm on there. Say Anything Blog has a page on Facebook and a Twitter account as well. So if you want to follow those, they're great ways to get all of my content, blog posts, print columns, and, well, this show. Those are great accounts to follow. And thanks for listening. I appreciate it. We'll talk again.